are you really trying to say that somebody who has been suffering from over a decade long of IBS, or somebody that's had rheumatoid arthritis and has had their joints replaced and stuff like that, and they're finally finding healing in a way of eating and there's something wrong with that? If somebody hops on a carnivore diet and they put their autoimmune condition into remission, I care about that a hell of a lot more than a meta-analysis in 10,000 people that says that their LDL went up and we're worried about that. Like, to me, like, we're just, what are we talking about here? People getting better and having a higher quality of life, or this like risk of disease that you don't even fully understand? It doesn't make sense to me. Man, it really seems like autoimmune conditions are really tightly tied to mental health, and gut health seems to play a role.
All right, welcome. We got Chris Irvin with us. Chris, good having you here again. For those that have not met you before, don't know, can you just give us a quick background on what you do?
Yeah, so thanks for having me on again. Yeah, so my background was trained in traditional nutrition through most of my undergrad, and got introduced to the keto diet during my grad school, and got to study the keto diet for sports performance, looking at, for strength, keto for power, and baseball players. What do we have? Basketball players, soccer players, all kinds of different athletes. And then got to then move on and start studying the keto diet in animal models of different therapeutic uses. So looking at cancer, diabetes, all of those sorts of things. So that's my traditional training that brought me to keto. And then since then, when I graduated grad school, I just felt this calling to start putting more information out about keto. When I first started getting into this space, it was 2016, 2017. So there obviously wasn't as many keto people on social media and blogs. And I don't even think there was any foods in the grocery stores that were labeled keto yet at that point. My kind of calling was to try to get some of the information that was locked away in these journals out into the mainstream so that people could learn more about this way of eating that can provide some healing. So now most of my work now is working in metabolic conditions. I do a lot of content development, a lot of education, a lot of writing, looking at different versions of ketogenic diets, similar like carnivore, for instance, for different modalities.
Yeah, and you had a original degree in nutrition, was it? And then you got a master's in something, same thing? Is that how that works?
Yeah, so my undergrad was in exercise biology and exercise science. I was actually, in undergrad, I was more into, I wanted to be a professional strength and conditioning coach, NBA strength and conditioning coach, the way I wanted to go. And then after grad school, started working with athletes and got bit by the nutrition bug, primarily through bodybuilding. Interestingly enough, I got really passionate. I think it's a natural thing that happens to a lot of athletes when they're done being athletes, is they have to find something else to latch onto. And bodybuilding, weightlifting was a big one for me, which kind of bit me the nutrition bug. And so then I decided to go back to school to get a master's in nutrition science. And I didn't even have keto on my radar at the time. When I came down here, I was to Tampa, University of Tampa is where I went for that degree. I was more interested in the fact that they were doing research in bodybuilders. That was actually what brought me down here. And then first day of class, sports nutrition class, we have a lecture on keto for endurance performance, which I was a 2-sport college athlete. I was very much of the mindset that to perform optimally, you need carbohydrates. And then this first day of class, I basically had my whole worldview shattered, seeing all this research that, actually you can perform pretty well without carbs. So then I proceeded to get my master's in nutrition science.
What were the sports you competed in, Chris?
I was a basketball and baseball player.
Basketball and baseball. How tall are you?
6'3", which
6'3",
actually,
okay.
The reason why I'm not in my normal recording studio is I just blew out my knee a week ago. I had a pretty horrific injury, dislocated my knee and tore every single ligament in it.
So it wasn't a patella dislocation, it was a full knee dislocation?
Full knee dislocation, yeah. My tibia dislocated from my femur. Patella was to the right, tibia was to the left, tore ACL, PCL, meniscus, all of the good stuff. So I'm currently in a straight leg, lounging out on a couch right now. So not my typical recording scene here. So
the
basketball
sorry
days,
about that. That's a tough injury. God, that is a really big injury that you've had there. And so you're going to need to really rehab the hell out of that and keep a good diet. And gosh, hopefully you don't turn into an arthritic situation.
Yeah, it's a big, you talk about that. And I started seeing really quickly after the injury, it's only been a week now, how easy it would be to go down the path of not taking care of your body, not eating well, drinking, taking the pain medications, all of these things. And I quickly realized that if I want to have any sort of control, which it doesn't feel like I have much right now, the few things I can control is diet and what I put in my body. Fortunately, I was following carnivore at the time of the injury, and that's something I'm going to continue to do through this, because obviously we know that the anti-inflammatory effects of that are pretty profound. So hopefully that'll play a role in the recovery here.
Yeah. How did you do it, if you don't mind sharing that?
Yeah, so I went up normal basketball play that I always make. I went up for kind of drove baseline, went up for a layup. I got hit in the air and I landed a little bit awkwardly with my leg straight out to the side. But then the guy who blocked me then fell on top of my knee and then bent it inwards. It was actually a pretty intense injury. Amputation was on the table for some period of time there. They weren't sure they were assuming vascular injury and all of that stuff. But the one thing that surprisingly, most people will not agree with this, but the one thing that made me feel better about it was I train my knees really hard. It's something that's really important to me, is to protect them and keep them healthy. So I'm at least happy that it was a contact injury, because then I know it wasn't my fault. If it was a non-contact injury, I would have been mad at myself for not protecting my knees accordingly. So that's the one piece that I'm hanging on to, is I did everything I could do to avoid something like this.
Yeah, there's a point where the trauma is so excessive that you just can't. Obviously, a lot of the ACL injuries are basically plant pivot injuries where it's non-contact. But yeah, ACL, PCL, probably LCL. You're probably gonna have a multi-ligament reconstruction. You're in for some fun. Goodness, sorry about that. But what I will say, as an orthopedic surgeon, that if you keep your diet tight, you're going to limit the inflammation. You're going to improve probably your range of motion and on. And you are right that one of the concerns around a traumatic full knee dislocation is vascular injury. You have some very big vessels behind the knee that can be compromised, torn, kinked, whatever. And so until you straighten that knee out, there's a significant issue for that. So thank goodness that didn't happen to you.
Yeah, count my blessings.
Yeah, wow. You look pretty calm and comfortable for that injury. So when do you have a surgery date? Have they picked out a surgery for you? Have you already MRI, I assume?
A week from yesterday. So next Wednesday. And I got, one of the things I've been really fortunate with this is that just an incredible community around me of people that have reached out and tried to help me. And I was able to get my name moved up the list with some pretty profound surgeons. The surgeon that's doing my knee has done a lot of different baseball players in the area, a lot of pro athletes. He's worked with actually very similar injuries to this more recently. I was pretty fortunate on that side of things. It's going to be about a 4-hour surgery. They have 3 different things that they're going to have to repair in there. So it's definitely going to be intense, but yeah, I think the big thing for me was having somebody that I could trust, like having a guy that's worked on similar cases to this, that's had some really good success stories and everything like that means a lot, because it feels like there's a lot of things that aren't in your control when you're going through something like this. Yeah. Having somebody that you can trust makes a difference.
They're going to use allograft, I assume, for some of the reconstruction?
Yeah, so I think what the plan is they're going to do the patellar tendon graft for my ACL, I believe. And then they said they were going to do cadaver ligament for the PCL. And then they were going to be using what I believe is some sort of like a dissolvable suture for the MCL, because that ligament is apparently still intact. I think that's the order. I know there's at least a cadaver, there's something for my patellar tendon, and then something with the suture. Yeah. And which I wouldn't mind getting your insight on that. We can do it off air if we need to, but I've been wondering, I didn't realize how many different options there are that you can go for things like this. And I've been just listening to what they have to say. So I'd be curious if you have a different...
Honestly, the surgeon is going to be comfortable, and you want the surgeon to be as comfortable with what he uses as possible. Because whenever you start setting system, I want this, and then you're like, I'm not used to doing this. And so you increase the difficulty level. But cadaveric allografts there's a lot of usage for them where they've done very well. And obviously there's only so much of your own tissue you can take when you have a multi-leg reconstruction, and all of a sudden bone patella tendon has been the gold standard for ACLs for years, for particularly people that are high demand. And the assumption is you're going to go back to training hard and lifting and all those things as you recover, so I think you'll be in good hands. All right, let's talk specifically a little bit about sports performance. I literally just did another podcast before I came in with a guy asking about sports performance on carnivore. And I said, yeah, I think you can certainly do well with that. But what does the literature, I interviewed a guy named Phil Prinz the other day. He's a researcher up in the Pittsburgh area, and he's done some PhD research on some of this. He's worked with guys like Tim Noakes and some of the others that are fairly well known in the low carb space. But what is the latest sort of state of the art research on low carb, ketogenic, even carnivore? There's not a lot of research on carnivore, but we can extrapolate, say, about different types of sports. Are there some sports where it lends itself to, others where it doesn't, or does it depend on the athlete, or what does the research say?
Yeah, first thing you pointed out there is important that, we don't have a ton of carnivore research yet. I think still the general fear of red meat has prevented people from conducting those studies. But as you mentioned, we can infer from the low carb studies and the keto studies, because really the big thing that's happening there as it relates to sports performance is achieving a state of ketosis, which we know that you can do on a carnivore diet as well. And there's a large body of research looking at endurance performance with keto specifically, which it's a pretty easy thing to understand if you look at the fact that your body stores about 2,000 calories in the form of glycogen or stored carbohydrates versus 20,000 plus calories of fat, even in the leanest of athletes. You see that you're basically, when you're in ketosis, you're tapping into a larger fuel supply and then also producing this alternative energy molecule that can help with brain function which is a big thing when you're training, can just keep you motivated, keep you pushing through. So we have a ton of research, really monumental studies that have happened over the last 10, 15 years out of labs like Dr. Jeff Volek, showing that side of things. But when we look at some of the other literature for other uses, so strength, power, we start to see a little bit of a difference. We start to see it being not so clear that keto is beneficial. And actually, funny enough, right before we jumped on this, I opened up a paper that just got published today that was looking at the effects of a ketogenic diet on resistance training. And I always open up these studies expecting to see something different, and it's always the same thing. It's usually that either it's a short study in which they do it for 2 to 3 weeks, and then they see a decrement in performance. So then they say keto led to poor performance, which for anybody who's familiar with ketosis and becoming keto adapted, we know that in those first couple of weeks of keto adaptation, you can expect to experience some degree of sports performance, a decrease in your sports performance. Obviously, you can mitigate that through proper protein consumption and eating a nutrient-dense diet, electrolytes, all of those things. The other thing that you'll see in these studies, and this was a little bit longer study, I think it was 6 or 8 weeks. I haven't totally finished it yet, but you'll just see these things that say ketogenic diet doesn't impair performance. It'll be a null. Just it doesn't hurt it, doesn't help it. But the problem with that is that all of these studies are looking at just a traditional ketogenic diet. We're looking at the 20 to 25% of your calories from protein, 70 to 75% from fat, usually under 5% from carbohydrates. And for endurance performance, this works really well because that is a great macronutrient profile to get you in a pretty deep state of ketosis. You're going to be providing yourself with a ton of fat, which is a great fuel source for endurance performance. But when it comes to these other forms of performance, like power exercises, like strength exercises, and even those hybrid types of exercises like a basketball or a soccer or hockey where you're sprinting and then, taking a break, sprinting, taking a break for long durations. The fact is that we probably need a little bit different of a macronutrient distribution, which can still be keto in nature. And I think that's the thing that a lot of these studies are missing. When we see studies where they actually do bump up the protein a little bit, we'll see better outcomes for things like strength and power. But a lot of times when we're just looking at this kind of base keto diet, we're seeing that it doesn't really do much. It doesn't hurt it, but it doesn't necessarily help it. That's a call to me that we need to, one, understand that nutrition is personalized. That's across the board. That's whether we're talking about weight loss, sports performance, different disease treatment, any of that, it needs to be personalized. And when it comes to sports performance, that traditional keto diet that was invented for weight loss that works for these guys that are running 50 miles at a time and stuff like that is not the same diet that's going to be helpful for people that are trying to do essentially high intensity interval training or lift a lot of weight 1 or 2 times, something like that. So that's something that we need to look at more, because what we see in real life, and you're a case study of it, I'm a case study of it, everybody who's done it is a case study, is that when you alter a ketosis diet to fit the demands of an athlete, of somebody who's training hard, then you absolutely can see improvements in performance from that for a lot of different reasons. The literature is definitely not always in our favor when it comes to sports performance, but what we see in real life when you do it the right way is that it's definitely helpful.
Yeah, I'd love to see some carnivore athletic studies. I think that would be interesting, because I do think protein is because the traditional ketogenic diet was often at most moderate protein and sometimes low protein, quite honestly. Or I shouldn't say low protein, I should say equal to the standard American diet, which is about 15% protein, which I think is too low. I think that's unfortunate. It certainly doesn't serve athletes very well. And I know there's literature out there showing low carb diets and endurance athletes require more protein. That's been studied. We're seeing, I guess, greater and greater levels of the so-called threshold point where you switch from fat oxidation to the glycolytic type stuff being higher and higher. Whereas to say I think before it was somewhere around 60, the crossover point was something like 60% of VO2 max. Now we're seeing even up to 90% where fat is being used with athletes that are well adapted to this stuff. I think Tim Noakes and others have shown that in their data, which is interesting, that you can perform at this very high level, including high intensity level, and still be utilizing fat and only using a little bit of that glucose glycogen system that's out there. So I think for somebody, but in my experience, and because I get this a lot of people, they'll go on a carnivore diet, they'll do it for 2 weeks and say, I couldn't lift, and they quit. And I think really for an athlete in particular, independent of the generalized adaptation, which I think is 3 to 8 weeks for most people, even just for regular activities. But with athletes, I think you're looking at 3 months, maybe as much as 6 months to fully really adapt to it. And that's what I've done. I'm 57. I'm literally putting up lifetime PRs at 57 in some lifts. It's funny. I was in there doing a trap bar deadlift, 501 pounds. I hit it for 13 reps, which is the most I've ever done on a trap bar at 57. Yeah. I've only been doing trap bar about 8 years now. So I have to caveat that. So PR, but I've only been doing, but literally I was doing an overhead press. And the most I've ever been able to do, semi-strict, I'm not like rigid, but I'm not really push pressing it, was 230 pounds. And I did that back in my mid 30s. And I did 225 last night. Literally, I'm 5 pounds away from a lifetime best at age 57, which I'm like, and I'm just all on carnivore, and I'm not on drugs. I'm not taking TRT. Everybody always accused me, you're on TRT and steroids. I've never done that stuff. I have no desire to do that stuff. So it's interesting to see. I am happy to report, I think, I'm still waiting for the check to cash, but I've got a number of groups that are willing to fund carnivore research when it comes to disease mitigation, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, which I think, in my view, that's where my preference would be, because I think that's where you really, whether somebody can run 100 meters 2/10 of a second faster, I could care less in the grand scheme. I'd rather see somebody put autoimmune disease in remission. But we're starting to see that. And then once we start getting through IRBs and start saying carnivore research is legitimate, unlike there's a guy named Chris Gardner. I think I'm going to have a debate with in a couple months, but he's out of Stanford, and he's a big, well-known in the nutrition research, respected, I think. But he basically said on camera that it's unethical to study a carnivore diet. And in my view, it's unethical not to study it, because you have so many people who are doing it anyway. Why not study these people and find out if they are at risk or not, or what the benefits may or may not be? But to say it's unethical to study it, even though there's hundreds of thousands of people doing it now, to me makes no sense. But we'll see. So maybe we'll get, go ahead.
It's crazy. I was just reading, a bunch of people have shared it. You may have shared it actually too, that the Mayo Clinic did a hit piece on Michaela Peterson's website, The Lion Diet. The piece actually came out back in, I think, October of last year, probably about the time you were on Rogan. I was wondering if it was written in response to you going on Joe Rogan. That's why they put it out.
I went on Rogan in November. So
it was November. Okay.
A little bit. But yeah, okay. I can't remember. There's been so many, man. There's been so many hit pieces.
What they did in the hit piece that was crazy is they called that out. They were saying, for one, you can break down this article piece by piece, and it's hilarious. Some of the claims in there are just outright wrong. Saying that a carnivore diet, you have to worry about not eating, you're not getting any vitamin D is what they said. So that's a concern. That's just not even correct. So you're just putting some of this false information in there. But one of the things that they say is, they're like, the author says, it's not okay to have a website like this that's putting out this information that doesn't link out to any sort of peer-reviewed research. We have to have this peer-reviewed research for it, which I definitely get that. But for that particular website that they're calling out, there's 6 or 7 pages of these transformation stories of people who are following a carnivore diet for autoimmune conditions and seeing incredible healing. And I think when you see something like that, it's like, that should be enough to spark interest right there. Are you really trying to say that somebody who has been suffering from over a decade long of IBS, or somebody that's had rheumatoid arthritis and has had their joints replaced and stuff like that, and they're finally finding healing in a way of eating, and there's something wrong with that? And I think that for me, I'm glad that you're funding research, because we have to have people like yourself doing research like this, because what we're finding out is that the big food and big pharma both are responsible for funding a lot of the studies that are out there, a lot of the nutrition studies especially. And that obviously comes with a lot of biases. We've even seen in studies where there was a study that was put out a couple of years ago where they looked at industry versus non-industry funded research. And it's crazy to see the differences in the outcomes of these studies when they're industry funded or not. And it's for these types of research studies, it's like, we can't really infer that much. So it's like, you want us to link out to these peer-reviewed studies, but here's the deal. Most of them are funded by big pharma. Most of them are funded by big food. So can we even trust these things? Like, for me, what I care a lot more about is what happens in real life. If somebody hops on a carnivore diet and they put their autoimmune condition into remission, I care about that a hell of a lot more than a meta-analysis in 10,000 people that says that their LDL went up and we're worried about that. Like, to me, like, what are we talking about here? People getting better and having a higher quality of life, or this like risk of disease that you don't even fully understand? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, admittedly, obviously, most of the data on carnivore diets, particularly, have been anecdotal, and there's an overwhelming amount of it. I mean, now we're talking into the tens upon tens of thousands of people who have put disease in remission, and at the same time, you're saying where's the research? But at the same time, you're saying it's unethical to do this. This is kind of a catch-22. I'm happy to report, like I said, particularly like you mentioned, IBS, but IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, we are going to see a published case series of people with bona fide disease with biopsy-proven, colonoscopy-proven disease, and completely proven remission. That's going to be published probably next month. That should hopefully will generate an intervention trial. Maybe we can do an intervention trial to put people on the diet and see how it goes. So we're getting there. It's bit by bit. And then what happens to the haters at that point when they say, no, it isn't a literature, then they're going to complain about the literature. It's not the perfect study. It's not, it'll never end because there's always going to be people that are pushed, whether the research are there is not. And I don't think you need a study to convince you to try something because, and that's why these success stories, and I've got over 1,000 of them on my webpage, Carnivore.diet. We've got over 1,000 success stories. That's remarkable. You think about how many interventions across the world have 1,000 success stories they can rely on. Most of them, you go to most places and they've got three success stories, and that's and they're selling their product. And we've got 1,000, right? It's a ridiculous amount of people that have changed these diseases, and it's growing every day. And there's more and more people that are waking up to this, and they're like, "Look, it's undeniable at this point." And I don't care how many studies talking about how wonderful vegan diets are, when it's all just the problem with nutrition science in many ways is it's really hard to do a good study. It really is hard to do a really good hard endpoint clinical study over a long period of time where you really know what people are doing. And so you end up doing short-term studies, or you do studies where you look at biomarkers, which they're questionable as to what they actually mean in many cases. And we're seeing that there may be some nuance around even things like LDL cholesterol, where we say LDL cholesterol is causative for heart disease, end of story, done. If your LDL is higher, you're doomed, right? And we're seeing that maybe there's some dependency there, and maybe it depends what else is going on. That's a reasonable, plausible nuance that a lot of people are dismissing it. Nope, doesn't matter. I think we're going to see that change as time goes by. We'll see what the studies show.
Yeah, I think too, like on that side of things too, when you look at, okay, so even in a study, if you see something that provides benefit, if we look at the vegan twin study, that the Netflix documentary came out, everybody's been talking about it. And the benefit that they reported there was these very mild increases in LDL, or minor decreases in LDL from the vegan group, which obviously we just talked about. That might not mean what we think it means. But the part that they don't talk about is that I forget the number of people that were on the vegan diet. It was 22 was the number of people.
Yeah, but 20, I think 21 twins finished the study. They started 22, had one dropout, 21 finished, 21 pairs, right?
Yeah, 21 pairs, and 21 of the people, it was like 20 out of the 21 people on the vegan diet said they wouldn't continue the diet and that they didn't enjoy doing it. So it's even if that study showed these remarkable changes, and even if we could tie those changes back to a reduced disease risk, that doesn't mean that anybody, like you're talking about a controlled setting in a laboratory where you're, in this case, you have a little bit more control than what happens when somebody goes out into the real world. So if people don't if a vegan diet was the way to go, but if people can't follow it for more than 4 weeks, then that's not going to be very helpful, right? So I think that's the other thing too, is like these studies aren't always, we have to always look at, okay, here's what happened in the study, here's what we can infer from it, and then here's a practical application into the real world from the study that we can take from it, which is usually a jump that people aren't willing to make. A lot of times they just want to read these research as black and white. This diet's good, that diet's bad. Red meat causes heart disease or causes cancer. People don't want to dig in any deeper than that.
Yeah, they looked at, obviously, the biomarkers as some of their outcomes, but some of the goofy stuff, the vaginal temperature probe thing, I mean, just ridiculous stuff that is, quite honestly. But I mean, one thing that was struck out to me was the vegans, all the vegans that at least they highlighted in the documentary had lost or gained less muscle mass than their omnivorous counterparts, which to me is a real problem. If you're losing muscle or not gaining muscle compared to your twin peer, that to me is problematic. And yeah, it's to the credit, it is well choreographed and cinematography good. It's a good, compelling, emotionally successful propaganda. That's what it is. It really is that. And they do a good job. I mean, they'll get people who'll go to vegan and they'll do it for a month or two and then they'll quit. This is what'll happen. And the thing is, like I said, with regard to the vegan stuff, and I asked this, I said, well, if a vegan diet is so good and it's what we're meant to do and it has all upside, why has humanity not already adopted it? Because we clearly we've had the capacity to do that for centuries, arguably. Ever since we went to agriculture, we still kept eating meat. Even though we had plenty of other calories, we still kept eating meat. Why did we do that? Why not? Why didn't we just say, okay, clearly I feel better with this. And people will say, it was funny, I said, because meat tastes too good. And I'm like, why do we think meat tastes good? What is it about it that makes meat taste good? And then they lose the argument because it's like, maybe it tastes good because we're supposed to eat it. And people make the argument about sugar, but sugar doesn't naturally occur outside of things like fruits and things like that, which I would argue are also potentially part of our sort of natural diet in a way. But to say that we shouldn't eat meat, we're programmed to taste something that tastes good to us that we're not supposed to eat doesn't make sense. Now, again, obviously the food industry has hacked that with ultra-processed foods and sugars and artificial flavors to trick us into consuming that stuff. But it just doesn't make sense to say the only reason I'm eating meat is because it tastes good. The only reason I do a carnivore diet because I like the taste of meat. I like the taste of chocolate cake, and I don't eat that. If I was going on just a diet I'd be eating the standard American diet like everybody else does. But I'm not doing this because of my taste buds. I'm doing it because I'm concerned about my health. Yeah. So as far as, let's jump, back to sports, do you find that there are certain people that will do better or worse on a low carb versus a high carb diet? Is there some or type of athlete, or do we know?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think generally speaking, the athletes that are doing more endurance type of training are going to mostly just adapt better. I think that a big thing when it comes to adapting to a low carb diet, becoming keto adapt, is that you have to, one, be able to produce the ketones, which happens through burning more fat. And then you also have to be able to utilize those ketones, which happens through upregulating the transporters that are required to take ketones into cells. And the way that you upregulate those transporters is by having increased blood levels of ketones. Endurance performers will typically adapt faster to it because of the way that they're oxidizing fat during their exercise, the way that they're able to quickly deplete glycogen, all of those things. Whereas I think that, like you said, people following like a carnivore diet, they'll say they're strength training, they'll report early on that they're struggling and they'll have a hard time with it. So I think just from a type of athlete thing, that's probably the biggest difference. But then from there, I think it really does depend on where the person's coming from a diet, I think is what plays a big deal. If somebody's coming from a paleo diet, or if somebody's coming from a already relatively low carbohydrate diet, then they're going to transition very easily into this. For me, I follow a low carb diet year round. That is my baseline, is to be between low carb and keto. And then periodically I go through somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks of doing a carnivore diet. And when I transition from that keto to carnivore diet, it's smooth. I don't notice any decrease in performance. I don't notice anything. In fact, it's always better from it. I find myself being stronger in the gym from those things. But if I were coming over from a standard American diet, that'd be a big switch. And the other thing that we have to take into consideration for a lot of people is that food, there's a psychological component to food. And people who are traditionally eating a standard American diet are more used to eating food for comfort. They're used to eating food for taste. Maybe it's something that they turn to when they're not feeling well, or they use it as like an emotional thing. So then to remove those things, you're taking a crutch away from people. So then you get this mental side of things where, and this is true, when I say this, a lot of us are probably picturing a certain person in our mind, maybe somebody who's very unhealthy or overweight, but this is true of the fitness industry. If we look at people in the fitness industry, the whole, if it fits your macros, how many Pop-Tarts can you squeeze into your macronutrients and still stay in your calorie deficit? We see that these people have a hard time going away from these foods. And when you take those foods away, it's not just about what's happening like physiologically when it comes to performance. There's also that mental side of things. And if you have been traditionally trained that, hey, carbohydrates are what I need to perform well in the gym, then you're probably going to go into the gym not on carbohydrates, feeling like you're going to have poor performance, and then probably manifest that into poor performance. So I think a lot of it comes into like where people are currently coming from. Like even if you're not low carb, if you come from paleo to a keto or carnivore diet, I think that you're going to be better because you're already accustomed to not consuming food just for pleasure, but consuming food for function, which I think is a big mindset shift that a lot of people have to go through. But one of the things I think is most interesting on the sports performance that people don't talk about, and I was going to call it out when you were talking about your shoulder press, getting ready to set that PR, is that a lot of times when we think about performance, like nutrition as it relates to performance, all we think about is like biochemistry and energetics. We just think about the glycolytic system and fat oxidation, all these different things. But there's other things that come. Food is not just energy. Food also provides a lot of other things. And when you look at like a carnivore diet, for instance, one of the reasons why you're probably able to better do an overhead press as you've gotten older is because you're consuming nutrients that are strengthening your joints, strengthening your ligaments. Your inflammation is low, so you have better mobility. You have better gut health, so you're not operating in a state of systemic inflammation. And those are all things that are going to improve your sports performance, but not necessarily in a way that we would be able to quantify in a study. And I think that's something that we have to remember, is that like food provides nutrients that our body uses in a lot of different ways. Even protein, when people look at protein, they only think about muscle growth. They don't think about the many other things that protein is used for. So I think that's a big thing to keep in mind too, is that the longer you follow a diet like this, again, you look at the research, we're looking at 6-week, 8-week studies. And as you pointed out, that's not going to be long enough to really be able to tell things. But what we see in people that are long-term adapted, you look at the monumental Volek studies from 2016 on endurance performance. These are people that were 12 months or more fat adapted. Of course, they're going to be seeing much different outcomes than somebody who is a carb adapted athlete. And I think that same thing would be true for you. You take another 57-year-old and you put him next to you, 57-year-old that's been eating a plant-based diet or a low protein diet for their whole life, to think that their body is going to have the resiliency to be able to do an overhead press similar to you, even if they had your same body mass, it's not going to be the case. Yeah, I think that even in these other cases outside of endurance performance, like strength and power, there's a lot that is not talked about where people can see sports performance improvements and maybe not even relate it to the diet, but really the diet is contributing a lot.
Yeah, I think, like I said, if you put somebody on a cycle ergometer or something like that, and you throw them through a Wingate test, and you can say, we gave these people carbs and their power output was a little higher than the ones that out. But when you do that day in, day out for 6 months a year, and you start to see that, again, it may be this because I'm an older guy and I've got a lot of mileage on me. And so if I eat carbohydrates, my shoulder hurts a little more, my knee hurts a little bit more. And guess what? Guess how hard I'm going to train in that state? I'm going to train less hard because it hurts and I don't feel like going to the gym, or I don't feel like pushing as hard. But when it doesn't hurt, I'm going to go for it. And to be able to do that day in and day out consistently over time, over a period of 6 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years, results ultimately in a better performance. And I think this is where, like I said, it's really hard to study that, as you mentioned. And it's interesting because I do this rowing stuff, this indoor rowing on the concept. I've broken I've got, I don't know how many, 7 or 8 American records now, and several, I think I'm at 4 world records on that. Age class, obviously, is a caveat there, but my numbers are pretty damn close to most 20-year-olds. I mean, honestly, nice. You can put me next to an Olympic, a legitimate Olympic rower over 500 meters, and I will either keep up with them or beat most Olympians. Now, granted, they're training for a slightly longer distance, 2,000 meters, but I mean, it still puts it out there that I'm still putting out at a high level. Yeah. The interesting thing is, within the rowing community now, and you look at the age-related world records that are out there, a lot of those athletes are carnivore. I know a lot. Really? They're like carnivore. And there's like, when I won the world championship in 2018, I went down, it was held in Long Beach, California. And it was because it was local to me. So I went and I won I think it was over 50. So I won the 50 plus world championship. The guy in the 40 plus was also carnivore that won. And there was another athlete that was one. And then like last year, like the top 5, I think it was like 4 out of the top 5 ranked guys were all on carnivore. So it's like, this holds up.
Is that something that is that because of you? Did you bring, or is that something they found?
I'm sure there's people that saw me doing it and wanted to try it, and then they found out that they had success with it as well. And so it's obviously, this is a very niche sport. There's 40,000 people every year that compete. So it's not that small. There's a decent sized population. And like my times on the rower, my 114, 500 meter, Brian Shaw rows that. Brian Shaw is world's strongest man. He's 6'8", 400 pounds. That's his time. The Olympic champions don't row that fast. They're usually like 119. CrossFit champs are usually in the upper 1 So I was faster than all those guys on the same pace as a guy like Brian Shaw. So it's not it's not an easy thing to do. It's legit high level physiology, tons of strength, tons of just being able to, cardiovascular fitness is going on there. It's a really nice performance metric for me. And I usually like to use it compared to how I'm doing athletically. And at 57, I'm putting up the same numbers I was putting up 7 or 8 years ago when I was in. So I really have not lost anything over this period of time, where most guys in their 50s start to see a decline. And we'll see what happens when I get to be 70, because 70 is when people really start to tank off. And so we'll see. So this is fun. This is a fun experiment that I'm running here. We'll see how.
I think that it's a good to have a consistent thing to compare yourself to as well, because if you don't, for a lot of people, they they'll jump on New Year's hits, right? It's January 1st, and they jump on low carb, keto, carnivore diet, and they also start going to the gym for the first time. They haven't gone to a gym in who knows how long. And then they're complaining about their strength and stuff. It's, what was your strength before? Like, you haven't been training. So I think having that thing that you can compare to, like for me, it was basketball, of knowing, like I played basketball in college. I know how my endurance was. I know how my explosiveness was, strength, all of those things when I was out there. And that's something I've continued to play over the last 10 years since graduating from undergrad. So I can relate my performance back to that because it's the thing that I've done the most. So I think that that is a better way to assess yourself. Because even like a Wingate, when I was in grad school, we would participate in a lot of the research studies that we would do. And like on a Wingate bike, there's specificity of training is an important thing, right? Like we know if you want to dunk a basketball, for instance, the best way to train to dunk a basketball is to practice dunking a basketball. It's going to be way better than other things help. Obviously, squatting will make you stronger, all of that, but specificity matters. And like on things like a Wingate bike, you can game that. Like you can, like we had a biomechanics professor that one day was watching me do the Wingate bike, and he was like, do this small change and you'll increase your power output by this much. And I make that change and it's holy cow. It had nothing to do with my nutrition. It was just like I got better at doing this thing. So I definitely think it helps to have that thing that you do. And it doesn't have to be sports. Like for people who are listening, if it's like playing with your kids, do you have more energy when you're playing with your kids? Do you, like when you go for a walk with your friends, do you have more energy? Like whatever your thing is that you do that is the most physical thing, have that be the thing that you monitor and you compare against when you make a nutrition change, because that's how you're going to be able to figure out, is it this or is it a number of other factors that's playing a role in whatever the outcome is.
Yeah, too many people just, what do I weigh? I mean, that's their
exactly.
metric, and it's what's your body composition, how much body fat are you? And like I said, I'm very fortunate that I have a number of different metrics that I've pushed myself in. How much can I deadlift? How much can I overhead press? How fast can I row 500 meters? How far can I jump? All those things, I know what I've done in the past, and I have a good idea what's good for me. Like for me, like deadlifting, like I don't care how old I am, 500 pounds will be the standard. If I can't do 500, well, obviously I'm a big, strong guy and it's not appropriate for everybody, but for me, that's like my cutoff point. And it's funny because I get people that'll say, why are you lifting so heavy? And I said, I did it for 20 reps. So obviously it's not that heavy for me if I can do it for 20 repetitions, right? It's not like I'm struggling with a 1 rep max. And I think there's different mindsets for that. But I always laugh when people say, oh, you're too old to be lifting all that heavy stuff. And I'm like, no, I disagree vehemently. It makes the rest of my life quite a bit easier, but
it's crazy that we just have in our society this, and I feel like it's happening early and earlier. Like we have this kind of notion that like with age, we have certain things are just supposed to decline. And I don't know if it was, obviously I'm in my 30s. I'll turn 32 this year. So it's hard for me to compare it to like past generations, but I feel like in my generation, it's becoming even earlier and earlier that people are saying that. Most of my college teammates that I played sports with, they don't play sports anymore. Like a lot of the guys that I grew up with, like that worked out and stuff, none of them work out anymore. And of course, careers and kids and a lot of stuff plays a role in that, where people will just decide to put that stuff to the side. They just don't find the importance in it. But it's crazy how early that happens. Like you should be, like the goal should be to stay as strong as you can, as long as you can to life. Cause I'll put my money on the fact that if you're 57 and you're able to deadlift 500 pounds for reps, I think come 75, 80 years old, you're gonna be pretty happy with your ability to do things. And there's gonna be a big difference looking at you at 80 years old versus somebody else at 80 years old who can barely walk. So it's, you want to hang on to these things for as long as possible. And even if you look at the most extreme cases, look at Alzheimer's disease, for instance. And one of the things that's a big issue there is that people will eventually stop moving their body and then they'll lose the ability to walk because they stop doing that. And it deteriorates very quickly. And it's like one of the best things to combat in that situation is to just try to keep them moving. Don't let them stop moving, because once they stop moving, it's hard for it. The concept of if you don't use it, you lose it. There's a lot of truth to that. And so, yeah, I think it's crazy that anybody would look at what you're doing, especially considering the fact that it's not like you're coming up injured every other week. It's not like you're walking around hobbled. I see you at conferences, you're walking standing straight up. You obviously don't have a hunch in your back. You're not in chronic pain or anything like that. It's crazy that anybody would think what you're doing is a bad thing.
Yeah, I feel I injured my neck doing jiu-jitsu. That's just one of those things that happens. Yeah. But it's not the training. It's not the everyday activity that does that. And like I said, I've recovered from that, and I'm still back at the highest level I think you can get at this point. But to your point that, and I know we were talking about nutrition, but to me, the biggest discriminating factor between those that age and those don't are the people that stay active and train. And I put this little meme up where it says, if you don't regularly seek to find your limitations, those limitations will find you. And that is to say that if you're not out there pushing yourself to the limit of what your body can do, those limits will come and find you narrow. And then all of a sudden you'll be the guy on the walker at 75, just walking around the grocery store because you didn't expand what you can do. And I think, like I said, the more you can do physically, just the healthier you are. It's clear. The farther you are from death, because outside of a traumatic injury, most of us, when we die, are in bed, laying there, unable to do much. And I think we just see that narrower and narrower as it becomes a chore just to walk around the house. And then we're bedridden and then we're dead. So as long as you can get out there and run and play and jump and sprint and all those, which all things I still do. I still have to do sprints and still pushing myself to a degree. And I know, like I said, with your injury, it's got to be frustrating because, and this is a hard thing, is because it has a psychological toll. Whenever I do have an injury and I feel I tweak something, I pull a hamstring and I can't run, I feel vulnerable. I feel like, hey, I can't defend myself. I can't run away. I can't protect my loved ones or something like that. And it's mentally difficult. And so I feel sorry for you at this point, but I know the diet will help you, because the diet will help with the brain. It does. The diet helps to give your brain the right fuel so you can adapt. And I'm sure you've got a rehab plan and you're going to be getting after it right after you, as soon as the doctor releases you. And I'm sure, because you're looking at probably 6 months to a year of grind to recover from this thing.
Yeah, it's funny. I had the thought, I'm a big fan of The Walking Dead. I've always been a big fan of like zombie movies. And I had the thought the other day, I was like, man, this would be a terrible time for the zombie apocalypse to start. I would not be very useful.
Yeah. There's a lot. Often when I go out, I go to the grocery store and everybody's in there. Half the people are in there obese and they're just, they're walking slow. And like I said, if the zombie apocalypse came, these people are all cannon fodder. The zombies are going to eat you guys first because they can't do anything. It's sad to be in a situation where you're so relatively incapacitated. You could not even run from a slumbering zombie. You got some zombie with drooling and calling for your brains, and you can't even get away because you'll pull a hamstring, try to run 3 miles an hour or something. Hopefully we'll never have the zombie apocalypse. I don't know. Right. As crazy as times have been, maybe that's coming next. Who knows? So Chris, are you still doing active research? What do you do in your day to day? Are you actually involved with research right now?
Yeah, so most of my research now is for just writing. I've been really leaning into writing lately, and especially with this injury too. So a lot of my research that I do is just researching the existing literature and then packaging it in different ways for education. So I just put out a book at the first of the year called The Carnivore Reset, which was the last year and a half.
Who did you write that with?
Cynthia Thurlow.
I think I did something with that. I can't remember if I
you did. You wrote us an endorsement for it.
Something like that. Yeah, that's right.
So that was a big kind of research project for me over the last year and a half of studying gut health, because that was an area that I didn't really know much about. I came from sports performance, coming into nutrition. So then was really, again, focused on like bioenergetics, metabolism. I stepped away recently, but prior to that, I was working for BioCoach for a few years. So was very plugged into like metabolic health, and then realized that like gut health was this like gap in my understanding. I didn't really have a great grasp on that. Spent some time researching that. And part of that was influenced by my wife. Shortly after we got married, she got diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis. So she had like an autoimmune condition. And I started noticing that there was some similarity. When she would have these flare-ups, she would also have some digestive things going on. She would have maybe just some burping, or she would have a little bit of like stomach pain, or just these like little things. And then she would also maybe feel a little bit like more down when she had this pain. And I started putting these things together. It really seems like autoimmune conditions are really tightly tied to mental health, and gut health seems to play a role. So I spent this last year doing a lot of research into that to look at, because I also had this kind of speculation that for people who are using the carnivore diet for autoimmune conditions, was that gut health was the kind of the big thing that was being repaired or restored with the carnivore diet. Through looking into that more and understanding it more, you realize that a lot of what we've been told about, just like everything else, a lot of what we've been told about gut health is rooted in not that great of research. Like the research on fiber for gut health is not what you think it is. The research looking at prebiotics and probiotics and all these different things, it's just not it's not really what we thought it is. After getting to dive into it and looking at, okay, what is, for one, just the anatomy and physiology of the gut? What is the intestinal barrier? What role does that play? When leaky gut, which I know people are apparently not liking that term anymore because it's not a medically acknowledged term, but leaky gut having damage to your intestinal barrier, what cause does that have on your overall health? And then looking at the carnivore diet and saying, okay, we know there's kind of two sides to the carnivore diet. And a lot of people talk about the carnivore diet as an elimination diet. And prior to this research that I did over this last year, that was how I looked at it. It was like, oh, most of the benefit of a carnivore diet is what the diet isn't. If you have bad gut health, if you stop eating processed foods, that's going to help. And then you start looking at some of these compounds that are found in plants like lectins and phytic acid and oxalates and FODMAPs, all of these different things. And you realize, okay, if you have a sensitivity to these things, cutting those things out makes sense. So again, the diet's what it's not. But then you start looking at what meat actually provides, and you start realizing that, okay, meat is providing all of these nutrients that are essential for gut health, nutrients that restore your intestinal barrier, nutrients that keep inflammation low, nutrients that can actually feed your gut microbiome, starve off bad bacteria that we don't want in our gut, all of these different things. So that was a big thing for me over this last year, was seeing the role that plays in conditions like autoimmune diseases, which ranges from, autoimmune is obviously pretty broad. And I think sometimes people only think about its relation, like IBS or arthritis or any of those things. But even things like acne can be autoimmune in nature, right? Constipation, these little things that you wouldn't really chalk up to a more major health disorder are related to autoimmune, which seems to be related to the gut. So a lot of the research that I'm doing now is like pulling on these threads that I'm seeing pop up. I feel like I've studied keto pretty exhaustively. I think that one of the next areas that I want to really get into with keto that I've also spent the last year studying more of is keto for Alzheimer's disease. My grandmother passed away from Alzheimer's a couple of years ago now, and that kind of sent me on a thread of just trying to understand that condition more. So that's really what my kind of research is looking at, is like, where am I seeing these opportunities where like carnivore is helping people with autoimmune conditions? So let's pull on that thread and figure out why. We saw this last year, Dr. Chris Palmer published research on keto, published his book that was talking a lot about like keto and low carb diets for mental health disorders. There's a thread there that we need to pull on. We need to understand that a little bit more. And for me, I got out of traditional, I was between going the PhD route when I was in grad school, but I got a little bit hung up on the idea of most traditional PhDs spend most of their career studying one thing. I think where I had this realization, I went to the strength and conditioning, the CSCS or the NSCA conference in New Orleans one year. And there was this doctor up there who was getting ready to retire. And he had spent his whole career studying post-activation potentiation, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but it's this phenomenon in strength training. And I think that kind of turned me, I was like, I don't know if I want to study one thing for my whole life. I think what I would rather do is go on these sprints of trying to understand a topic in complexity and then move on to something else. So that's how I'm looking at research these days.
Yeah. When you were part of clinical trials in the past, you'd done some of that and worked within that. And post-activation potentiation, I think, is pretty cool. I've used that as part of my training process.
Yeah, same.
And obviously, if you want to know something, that would be the guy to talk to, it sounds like.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess you have the intellectual curiosity. And the thing about, and I want to just, maybe we've got a few minutes left, but maybe the fiber thing, because we often hear that fiber is essential for good gut health. I point to a recent paper, I don't know if you're familiar with Tommy Wood and Lucy Mailing put out, I think, a year or two ago. And it said basically our gut is very metabolically flexible. Our gut and our gut health and our microbiome actually have quite a bit of adaptive capacity, as would make sense. Yep. And they don't necessarily need fiber to do the things that fiber is purported to do. Short chain fatty acids, colonic mucosal health, things like that. You can do it without the fiber, which I think is, it makes sense clinically with what I'm seeing, because I see people that literally give up fiber and their gut health dramatically improves. And you're like, how do you explain that if fiber is necessary and so great for everybody? And yet we're seeing these obviously clear contradictions out there, and not just one or two. We're talking hundreds and now thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah. When I was in my undergrad, I remember didn't have a lot of nutrition classes in undergrad, but I remember the big threads that they were always talking about was that people are eating too much cholesterol and not enough fiber. Those were like the two biggest problems with our society. So that was something that was ingrained into me. And even when I started getting into keto, And looking at keto research, I was still a believer of that's why you got to have the leafy green vegetables. We got to be able to get fiber in our diet. Cutting out carbs is good, but we can't cut out fiber. But then I realized that what is that rooted in? Like, where did that come from? Why do I think that? And then you look at the studies and you realize most of the research that's just supporting the use of fiber is comparing a standard American diet to a diet in which somebody starts eating more fiber. Mm-hmm. So I always make the analogy that like, yeah, if you're eating McDonald's and you trade that for broccoli, like you're going to see some improvements in your health. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily fiber that's causing those things. But to your point, it is really interesting how fast the gut microbiome changes. Like we see that the gut microbiome can change within hours of consuming food. You talk about following a carnivore diet, within just a couple of days, you're going to have a dramatically different looking gut microbiome, and a gut microbiome that hasn't really been traditionally studied because we don't often look at people who are eating all meat diets. So then we have to wonder, like, how do things change? Like, does that gut require the same nutrients? Do those bacteria require the same fuel? And we do know also that there are other nutrients like lysine and things that you can get on a carnivore diet that can also fuel these gut microbes and help the good ones grow. Yeah, it's definitely that was a big eye opener for me, that you realize that this dogma about fiber that's good for everybody. And you get pushback from people and say that fiber is good and a lot of people see improvements from it. And I'm sure that if you have a healthy, like for me, I have an iron gut, like nothing has ever bothered my stomach. I've never had issues with it. So yeah, if I didn't know any better and I just consumed fiber all the time, I probably would think things are going great and not notice anything. But you really have to open your eyes when you look at these people, like you said, who have had IBS or IBD, and they have not found any sort of, or even there's some great studies out there looking at people with constipation, chronic constipation. And you would think, oh, chronic constipation, number one recommendation, add more fiber, right? But you find that in these studies, those people who added more fiber, worse outcomes. The people who cut it out, better outcomes. And this goes with what we were talking about earlier, is that matters. Like what happens in real life matters. If somebody cuts out fiber and then they see a debilitating condition go into remission, we got to look at that, and we have to take that seriously. We can't just say, because if you're on the other side of that, what do you say? You say they just need more fiber. They need to double down on fiber. Is that why fiber was hurting them before? No, they saw remission when they took it out. We need to pay attention to that. So I think that, we just have to look at nutrition as this like very dynamic thing that once you start changing something, your body will adapt very quickly, and that may change what your body demands. And I think the gut microbiome is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, for sure. It's pretty clear. And as you mentioned, I think fiber in many cases is just a marker for high diet quality. And like I said, if you're comparing standard American diet to more fruits and vegetables, obviously the fiber diet is going to look better. But again, and the other thing is, I think we look at it backwards, because what people will say, the Mediterranean diet is the best diet. And therefore we're going to look at people on a Mediterranean diet and look at their gut microbiome and call that the healthiest gut microbiome. And anything that deviates from that is no longer healthy. And I think, I know I had a discussion with Tommy Wood on this the other day. I had a phone call with him. And I said, my belief is that healthy people have a healthy gut microbiome, and it can be varied. If you're healthy and you're free of disease, and your gut microbiome, whatever it may be, I don't care how many bacteroides or whatever species you have in there, whatever it is, healthy for you, and we don't have to manipulate it into some Mediterranean gut microbiome or whatever we decide is the healthiest diet. So we do tend to look at it backwards. Anyway, Chris, unfortunately, I got to run, man. It's been a pleasure. Yep. Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll chat again. Okay.
Yep. Sounds good, Shawn. Thanks for having me.